All right, beautiful. There we are then. Okay, so I think with this, we can probably start. But let me touch a couple of things. Are we all good? We are all good, yes. Okay. All right, beautiful. Then welcome everyone. My name is Jose Luis, as you may or may not know, and this is the second guest lecture on the guest lecture series for the class Introduction to Computational Design that I teach at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. This is the second lecture in the fall 2022 edition, and I am thrilled to welcome Sophie Kahn as our lecturer today. So before we start, I want to remind all of us of a few things. First of all, this is part of a class that we teach at Harvard University, in which the students who participate in this class actually just finished right today. They just finished this assignment where they were given the option to either 3D scan an object and make a creative interpretation of the object, or make a 3D print by really customizing the G code at a very low level. So I was actually very excited to make this lecture happen today, because now that we have tried what 3D scanning and 3D printing looks like, I was very excited to let Sophie show us how she thinks about these technologies from a creative and from an artistic point of view. So a little bit of infrastructure about this call. This call is happening on Zoom, and GSD affiliates and people who are taking the class are welcome to join this Zoom call. But this lecture is also being live streamed right now to YouTube. And there's a lot of people in the chat right now greeting you. So the way this is going to work is, I want to remind everyone who is on the Zoom call right now that if you turn on your webcams, you will show up on the YouTube live stream. So if you want to keep your privacy, just stay dark for the time being. And I would also like to remind everyone that the way this is going to work is that I'm going to invite Sophie to share some of her work. And then after that, we will do Q&A starting from the people who are on this call, on the Zoom call. And then I will also relay any questions that might be posted on the YouTube chat. I will relay them to you personally, Sophie. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest lecturer. I would like to introduce Sophie Kahn, who is a digital artist and a sculptor, and whose work addresses technology's failure to capture the unstable human body. So her work investigates the complexity and the poetics of capturing the female-identified body in the digital age. And in all her works, the human body is dematerialized, is separated from the physical, and then it's re-materialized into a vastly altered form. Like many of her contemporaries, who also used 3D printing and 3D software and fabrication tools against the grain, Kahn is very interested in situating this mode of seeing within a critical context. Subsequently, Sophie challenges standard viewpoints by creating her own subjective, embodied, and very human way of seeing through a technological lenses. Sophie has exhibited in New York, LA, London, Paris, Sydney, Tokyo, Osaka, Seoul, all the cool places. And her video work has been screened in festivals like the Transmediale, 01, Dance Camera West, Trampoline, Frequency, Currents New Media Festival, and the Japan Media Arts Festival. Sophie has taught in the Department of Digital Art at Pratt Institute as a visiting associate professor, and at Columbia, Chicago, and as a visiting instructor. Are you still there in any of these two institutions?
No, I'm not teaching at the moment. I'm just in the studio. I miss it, actually. So I love doing stuff like this.
Oh, so maybe we can try to like lure you to come northern. Anyway, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sophie Kahn.
All right. Thank
the
you
stage
so
is
much.
yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Okay, so all right, you're seeing the right slideshow?
Yes, we are.
The right image? Yeah, okay. All right, so yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I am really excited to be talking to all of you, and I'm going to go back about 15 or 20 years throughout this talk. But before I do, I wanted to give you just a little preview of the foundation of all my work. Oops, excuse me, I'll turn the sound up. So I'm not, and I know that everyone in this class has recently done some scanning, so I won't overly explain this. But every piece that I make starts with this device, which is a handheld 3D laser scanner. And what I love about it is it's very intimate and it's very painterly. And when I'm scanning a model, you can see that it's this very kind of one-on-one transaction, and also extremely subjective in terms of the choices that I'm making as I scan any image. So I started out as a photographer, but actually, as Jose and I were talking, I thought the background that might be most interesting for all of you is that I also studied at the Spatial Information Architecture Laboratory at RMIT in Melbourne. And I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with SIAL. They're a really interesting facility. I did a year there as a kind of collaborative project between artists and architects, and learned that architecture school was actually not a good context for me, and I was not trying to explain my work in design terms. I found really hard. It gave me enormous respect for architects and designers, actually. But what they were doing at this lab that was really exciting was that this was Mark Burry was the lead architect on this program. And what we're looking at is, I believe, a 3D print of the part of the Sagrada Familia. So he was the lead architect involved in their finalization and reconstruction of this famously unfinished building. And so they were using that same scanner to scan these maquettes and to reverse engineer. And I think they were using CATIA. They're getting information from the maquette that Gaudi left behind to try and inform the construction of the finished building. So this is one of the first scans that I ever made of my face, because as soon as I saw this device, as a photographer, I kind of was immediately fascinated. And I remember going to the tech at the lab and saying, well, you know, what happens if I use this wrong? What if I scan a person instead of an object? And he's like, ugh, don't do that. Don't do that. I'm like, why? What's going to happen? What if I misuse this? And he said, oh, you just get all these chunks floating in space. It's disgusting. So I feel like that's kind of been my work ever since, has been, chunks floating in space. But the thing that really struck me about this scan, because it's a laser, you've got to close your eyes. It takes about 5 minutes to scan a face. You've got to hold still. It actually looked to me like a death mask. It had this really eerie, haunted quality, and it really is a very partial depiction of life. There's a lot of the body that is left behind when these scans are made. And I think that that's been this nugget that has been at the heart of my work ever since, actually, is thinking about these unintended emotional resonances of technology. So I studied at SIAL back in, oh my goodness, 2003. So almost 20 years ago, and actually was really fortunate to be able to use 3D scanners and 3D printers at that time. But after graduation, I was basically making works like this one, which is a render. It was all image-based, because I'm not, again, so much respect to people who build tools and who hack tools and tinker with tools. I am not that person. I'm not a coder or an engineer. And so for me, making images was kind of the most that I could manage. Like this was before the real DIY revolution in 3D printers at a consumer level, maybe before the kind of stuff that predated the MakerBot. And so I really, once I left school and I couldn't 3D print on their printers anymore, and industrial printers would charge you, thousands of dollars, I went through a long period of maybe just making video and imagery. But the market kind of caught up to what I wanted to do round about 2010 or 2011. And NetFab, the software, kind of became more accessible and more user-friendly, and Shapeways started printing at cost-effective ways. And so I started actually being able to have a hand in my work. Prior to that, I was having to pay, like an engineer. So I was working with these big companies and factories and paying hundreds of dollars just for somebody to kind of work on my piece, because I couldn't work on it myself in the software. So then I started slowly materializing these scans, and I have a really large body of sculpture that is what I think of as death masks. So all made from 3D scans of people that I know, and all very, very fragmented. And as time went on, I also started hand painting them and treating them as much more sculptural objects, trying to understand how the data functioned when it was brought into the world as a material thing that you had to kind of contend with. And in practical ways, maybe it's going to break, maybe it's going to fall over, but also in more conceptual ways and thinking about what is the significance of these materials. What does it mean to work in plastic? What does it mean to work in PLA? And so a lot of this work has this very faux historical look to it. These are all life size, I should add, and they're all mostly printed in either nylon or ABS acrylic. And I was really inspired by archaeology, and by the idea of the fragment was also really big at the time in art theory. And there was a big show on archaeology at the MCA in Chicago right when I went to start my graduate studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2011. This sense that you can't trust any knowledge that claims to be complete, or any truth that claims to be all-encompassing. So there is a kind of safety in this sense of the fragment, and I remember was, reading Walter Benjamin and the Arcades Project and things that talked about little snippets and disconnected parts. And so I think that really informed the aesthetic of this work. And while it was digital, it also was very, very material and very sculptural. So with this piece, and I can't actually zoom in, I'm afraid, but this is on my website. And if you were to zoom in on this image, you would see that the model's face is covered in these striations that actually come from the print build lines. But this is a cast bronze. So when I went to grad school, I already knew the software. So there was no point really in me taking classes in NetFab or Rhino. So I came in and studied art and technology, which I went into in 2011, but actually what I really wanted to learn was how to make physical sculpture. And so I spent a lot of my time doing classes in mold making. So for casting, for a piece like this, I made my own silicone mold and I would pour wax into it. So the 3D print then was either burned away or it was used as just a master for the casting. So given that kind of archaeological background, I also want to show a few images that from various times that I kind of pulled together to give a little context to my work. So thinking about the fragment and how a digital fragment can exist in the material world, I started looking at archaeological evidence that was incredibly fragmentary and how the negative space is framed in some of these works. And actually, at one point, I collaborated with a museum mount maker for a show that I did at SAOC and had him build really similar steel supports to kind of hold fragments of some of my sculptures in space. But I'm also kind of a kid of the 80s. And so I'm also thinking about some of the science fiction that I saw growing up, the never-ending story where there's the edge of something and nothingness. And then sometimes I actually will open a lecture of mine with this clip from I think it's the 1982 Star Trek movie. If people have seen this, it's the scene where a crew member is beamed up and then they lose the tracking on his, DNA. And so he's horribly mangled. And when they lose him, when he comes back, his body is kind of destroyed. And that felt like the perfect metaphor for the work that I make, because the work is dematerialized, it's sent somewhere, often through the internet, and then it comes back in a really altered form, but it's really damaged. This is probably a graphic that I don't need to introduce to anybody, the idea of the uncanny valley, that as we approach the perfect verisimilitude of the human, paradoxically, the result becomes kind of much more horrifying. I'm also looking at a lot of kitsch. I actually love kitsch, and I try to have my work walk the line between kitsch and, it's a very, very fine line. This is imagery from a book called Saving Graces, and it's cemetery statuary from various European cemeteries. It's this kind of nexus of like hysteria and excess and death and sensuality and the weirdness of this imagery happening in a religious context also. So a lot of that was feeding into some of that sculpture that I was making probably about 10 years ago. But I kind of felt the need to address part of my own experience, which is in my 20s. I was ill and disabled for a time with chronic fatigue syndrome. I don't consider myself disabled any longer, but it is part of my history. And so also with my interest in photography and my interest in medical history, I narrowed down on hysteria, which again is probably a term people are very familiar with. It was overwhelmingly applied to women, although also really interestingly to men who'd returned from World War I with now what we would call PTSD. At the time, they were kind of considered male hysterics. And I got interested in the idea of photography being used to capture madness, which is, of course, you know, absurd. There's a really interesting book called The Invention of Hysteria, which talks about how a lot of this work was performative, the women's kind of role in their treatment, how horrific a lot of it was too. It's a really sad history. And all of this kind of clicked into place for me. And so I created this body of work in 2018 and 2019, and it's called Machines for Suffering. Comes from a quote attributed to Pablo Picasso, who apparently told his mistress Dora Maar that a woman is a machine for suffering. And in it, I had myself, but actually mostly models and dancers and performers. And we reenacted a lot of the poses that were supposedly typical of an attack of hysteria. So just going back to an image like this, we did it for the scanner. And so again, thinking about the ways in which the scanner is kind of shattering the body. And it's a body that's in extremis too, a body that is, you know, maybe in pain, in the midst of a seizure or ill. But there's also an ambiguity, and there's a lightness and almost an escape to these bodies, which I thought was really interesting and complex. So this is a life-size piece. This is 3D printed nylon, installed at Bitforms Gallery in New York. The show is called Out of Body, Sculpture Post-Photography. It was curated by Claudia Hart and Susan Silas. And this is a work by Susan on the back wall. My piece is called Machines for Suffering 1. And I also thought it might be interesting to show some of the behind the scenes for this work. So I printed it with, it actually wasn't Shapeways because at the time they're about to go out of business. And so I panicked and I worked with another SLS printing company. I think it was Exometry. And it had to be made in, you know, I think 50 pieces, maybe 40 pieces, and glued together, because these machines still have a pretty small build size. And actually, even though some of them will print large for economic reasons, it means they can't stack their builds really well. So you'll get charged much, much more to print something 50 centimeters than if you cut it up into two 25 centimeter pieces. I mean, you guys might have experienced this too with if you printed with any of the commercial service providers. So it was just like the world's worst 3D jigsaw puzzle, and so much epoxy and gluing. And again, you know, I would have loved if it had come out of the machine in one piece magically without any human intervention. It very much did not. A lot of my work is really much more laborious and hands-on and kind of old-fashioned than people really think when they see it. I once had a professor in grad school criticize me by saying, oh, you don't do any, you know, this dude was a photographer, by the way. And he's like, oh, you don't do any of this. The machine's doing it. The machine's making all the decisions. I'm like, that'd be great. I wish it did. It does not. So there's a lot of kind of, you know, human labor is involved. So the piece is glued, it's sanded, it's primed, it's epoxied all together. And then again, I'll hand paint it. And actually for this series, and these are some of the other pieces in this series, they're just called with Roman numerals. Some of them are named for the other phases of the hysterical attacks. I wanted them to look like they were kind of construction materials. I wanted them to actually look like wood and concrete, with the idea being that this was maybe some kind of really monumental object, or, you know, a body that was much, much larger than life, to kind of suggest that massive scale. These pieces are only about 15 inches or so, so they're kind of tabletop size, but the goal is to suggest that. And all hand painted with watercolor and acrylic and gesso. This was a show at C24 Gallery in New York in 2019 called Transfigured. And these, I also wanted to include these in this talk because these are, you know, more kind of typical, maybe architectural renderings of some of the sculptures. And I do call these blueprints. And I think a lot of my work actually stemmed from some of those first moments at SILE where I was taking a tool that was designed for architecture, but I was turning it on the body. And to me, that's always been a very fruitful place as an artist, to try and bring together two systems that might seem that they're opposing, and then to see what arises in the tension between those to kind of create an unstable condition. And then there's something that will come out of that is surprising. So these are very large Hahnemuller photo rag prints. They're archival inkjet, 40 by 60, or some of them are larger. So again, a really all-encompassing scale. So I might speed up a little bit because I see we're on 25 minutes here. The next series I worked on just pre-pandemic, fortunately, was collaborating with Butoh performers at Pioneer Works in Brooklyn during a residency. And I'll just show one more video from this series. So again, having kind of unstable bodies that are poised in space. This one became really much more explicitly about the digital body and how it kind of exists, or how we exist really as avatars in a digital world. And then how I handled that work materially. And this was a kind of performance where you can see people were watching through the windows of the studios in Pioneer Works. And I was projecting the data from the scan up on a large screen here. So the body of work that came out of this was called The Divers. And my main collaborators were Cindy Boots and Azumi Oe. And this is just a little side-by-side comparison of some of the artworks versus the real people who were scanned while they were being made. This can all be seen on my website. In 2020, I was going to have a solo show that never opened. It was meant to be March 13th. So it was ill-fated. After a lot of kind of grieving, I turned it into a VR experience. And there's a link to that on my site too, under the AR and VR. So it was fun because I was able to have a kind of Jeff Koons imaginary budget. And you can visit this piece either in a browser in Mozilla Hubs or in an Oculus headset. And these sculptures are really, really large. They get larger as you go through this imaginary museum space. And then we also kind of had a lot of performances and like activations within the virtual show. But really, I think my heart is with making objects and really with being with people in a room, with the collaborators that I worked with. So this is from a more recent show at Spring Break with my collaborator, Colette Robbins, and I will share the link to our YouTube channel later too, because we interview 3D artists, and we've got about 15 up already and we're doing more. So that's been really entertaining. And then I'm going to really, really speed through a couple of recent projects, a show on Feral File where people bought an NFT of the work and then actually received real 3D prints, which is still up. That show is called Doppelganger. This is a new project that I'm really, really excited about, and actually just found out that I've been going to be commissioned to make a version of this piece for Riverside Park in Harlem on the west side. I think it's about 145th Street in New York. It's through a program called Works in Public with the Art Students League and New York City Parks Department. So that's actually really where I'm kind of excited to go right now with some of these works, is to turn them into large-scale public sculpture. And this is a series of 3D scan portraits of individuals who've undergone various life-altering physical transformations and all have really kind of poignant and beautiful stories, and was made again just pre-pandemic, and I'm now resuming it slowly. It was a very intense emotional project and came out of a lot of really interesting, very beautiful, but very kind of raw conversations with each model. And this is one of the pieces that I'm starting to make. And then just lastly, there's a piece that I can't share the full details on, but it's a 21-foot CNC milled bas relief that's a corporate commission in Lower Manhattan that I'll be able to talk more about on social media really soon. And yeah, these are going to be this is my rendering of Portrait of Tea, which is that piece that I was just talking about for the Riverside Park Commission. So yeah, I wanted to keep this short because I really love the kind of Q&A portion. So I'm happy to take any questions. I can stop the share from here actually. Is that best? There we go.
Whoa. Thank you very much, Sophie.
Thank you.
That was beautiful. Before we start, I'm going to share on the chat the link to your YouTube channel, which I believe is called File Exchange, correct?
That's right. Yeah. Do you want me to look it up? I can look it up, or if you can.
No, I follow it, so I just pulled it up, and I'm going to share that as well on the YouTube live stream.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was really a pandemic project as well. We wanted to. We felt it was really important to build a context around artists working in 3D tools because I don't feel that there's enough kind of platforms out there. And a lot of my peers are really finding it challenging in terms of where exactly do you situate your work? You know, are you digital artists? Are you not? A lot of us cross back and forth quite a bit. And so then it was also, we were just trying to stay sane in 2020 and just wanted to like talk to everybody. And we started having these epic studio visits that would go on for 2.5 hours on Zoom. And then we thought, well, people might want to kind of tune into this. Like, this is really good stuff. So that's where File Exchange was born. But yeah, if I'm also open to recommendations for any other artists, I'm always interested to meet more. So yeah.
Well, we can probably have that conversation in parallel, but it resonates with me. I also have my YouTube channel is also a COVID project that I'm now very excited about continuing and making it like almost like a lifestyle.
Yeah. It's been really fun.
So I have a few comments or questions that I may want to use to break the ice, but I will offer those to you, but I will also invite people on the call to post your questions. So if you have any questions, like, feel free to jump in and interrupt me at any point. So when you were showing this idea of the 19th century and how they were using photography as a medium to study crazy people or people with PTSD or people with syndromes that we now identify as like, it just, I don't know, like the idea of phrenology just like bouncing my mind on that's like old school pseudoscience of like looking at people's skulls and trying to infer, just because of the shape of the skull, who was crazy, who was
based on measurement, right?
Yeah.
Get from a scan, you know. In fact, like one of my first jobs ever was working as a research assistant at the Children's Hospital in Melbourne with their 3D MD cameras and actually trying to measure children's skulls they were children with, it was the craniomaxillofacial department. And so we were like trying to figure out how to use that camera for that purpose. So, and that was doing it for the powers of good, obviously, like not the powers of evil, but I think it's going away. Yeah.
But it reminded me of like now, like the modern version of that, which is using AI for, you know, like pre-screening people and like assessing people's risk of like becoming a criminal or like entering the airport and trying to make a mess at the airport, you know, how like
I mean, you know, 3D oh no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, how we like as a society we have this tradition of like trying to use technology and science to like for purposes that like 10 years after, 20 years after, we're like, how could we even think about this, you know?
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, a lot of, I try and keep this in mind in my work and in trying to make critiques of my work. And, you know, sometimes it feels to me like some of the critiques I'm making feel a little dated because I'm talking about how fallible these devices are. And then, you know, it gets better and better and it gets like more terrifying in its ability to capture to data and people. And, you know, when coupled with facial recognition, when coupled with other kinds of tracking, you know, we know that so much of the technology that we're using originated from the military anyway, and that's where the funding came from, and that's why we have it. But I try to think about that. I try to suggest that maybe it can be, you know, manipulated, and also to suggest that there are maybe vast swathes of things about our lives and humanity that are maybe left out or that are unseen in a digital image of a person. And that kind of ineffable, you know, that humanity can be missing. But then that's a challenge as an artist too, because you want to make work that is expressive and that does convey somebody's humanity. You know, you don't want to make work that's all about the kind of deadness of technology. So I guess that's where the kind of poetics of failure come into my practice, in thinking about that the technology can be very flawed and very easily manipulated, but there's also a beauty to it.
There is a beauty to it, definitely. So you have expressed how a lot of your work revolves around the female identified body, right?
Mhm.
And how if your mode of expression is mostly the materialization in the form of some kind of sculpture or some kind of physical manifestation of this interpretation, where do you situate yourself in this perhaps dialectic of there's an inertia historically of the female body in sculpture and
Mhm.
perhaps some connotations of that body being objectified because
Yeah.
women being objectified in art, etc.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then by replicating this farther, do you think you fall into like perpetuating this paradigm, or is your work an active stance against
No,
this
it's
dynamic?
a good
What do you navigate that
good
situation?
question. No, it's a fair question. I think because I studied photography, so I was always really, really interested in women artists who were making imagery of themselves and who were kind of reclaiming those tools. So Francesca Woodman, I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with her work, but she was a really early favorite artist of mine, and she died very young, but she made these very partial, blurred, incomplete renderings of the body. And in all of them, the body is kind of escaping capture. It blurs, it slips away, it hides. There's this kind of war between the camera and her. And then there's a lot of other artists who I think are really interesting, really early artists like Claude Cahun, I'm mispronouncing her name, people who kind of changed. There was a lot of performance around gender, Cindy Sherman, like there were artists who were looking at reclaiming a lot of those tools. And so I think if right away, if you pick up the tool and you're using it on yourself or with a collaborator, like that power dynamic is going to be different. But having said that, I'm actually also conscious of the fact that like in the earlier work, a lot of the bodies were pretty kind of acceptable and aestheticized. And so I'm trying to move more to, embrace portraiture of other body types and actually also, people along the gender spectrum that is more diverse. And so that project started just pre-pandemic, and then all of a sudden I couldn't work with anybody. So now I'm still in the process of trying to expand that pool, because I think that kind of diversity is really important also in terms of, who's being represented in the work.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's a really, the story of that model in Portrait of Tea is a really poignant one. And it's, again, I don't want to kind of be telling somebody's story, but they're a former client of mine from my 3D scanning business who is trans and had found out they had a carrier of the BRCA gene, and so had to have a preventative mastectomy. And so they had done a performance where I had me scan their body pre-surgery, and then post-surgery had kind of pre-printed 3D printed this like breastplate and used that as a performance object. So that is all the artist's name is Tiger West, and I cannot take any credit. That's all their work and their idea. But Tiger was the first person that I thought of when I wanted to make these portraits. And that's the last image that you saw in the slideshow with the tattooed body. So post-surgery, they posed for me and created that piece. And originally we were going to manipulate it. And then together we had a conversation and they said, look, I think it's actually like perfect as it is. So that's the backstory of this large public sculpture that I'm working on now, which I think is there's a lot to kind of unpack in terms of the body, technology, illness, memory, partial capture.
How the skin is like manifests our history as well, which is because at the end of the day, your scanning is almost like taking that piece of superficial part of the body, which is the skin, which is like
Exactly. The scan does just show the skin and it's a hollow shell, right? Which is really strange. Yeah.
Which speaks to something that you mentioned before, the idea of lightness. Like how some of these sculptures, especially the machines for suffering, display this like perceived lightness that it's kind of also balanced out with like the heaviness of the support structures that are lightness in place, and almost a little bit as well like the strength of the gesture, because it's not, they're all like in this like kind of like really strong gesture, like
yeah, it's very, I was looking at a lot of Rodin at the time. I was in a show at the Maya Gardens that was like contemporary artists and Rodin, and so a lot of that, yeah, super 19th century, like over the top emotional. It's hysterical, right? It's like
yeah, exactly. I would like to open it up to the participants in the call if anyone wants to offer a question or a comment to Sophie. I could go on for all afternoon myself.
That's cool.
Any questions? Something you mentioned, I also want to open it up for the YouTube participants. If you want to post any questions, I'll be happy to relay to Sophie. Sophie, I was like jumping in my seat when you told this like small anecdote of your professor like yelling at you like, oh, the machine is like making all this decision for you. This is not art. Where are you? You know, like
Yeah, I know. I feel bad like continuing to like wheel out that anecdote, but I am still a little bitter about it, considering he was a photographer.
yeah, exactly. I mean, like I am an educator who teaches computation and technology as a medium, right? And for me, the idea I was yelled at like that when I was in architecture school by
Yeah.
using CAD to
Yeah.
draft and to draw buildings, and like because if I was not using pencil and a ruler, that was not really designing. It was just
Yeah.
being a draft monkey, right? So like, and we are really right now with the explosion in artificial intelligence, machine learning models, and especially this summer, after all these diffusion models just became available to all of us, in the design field, we're really questioning the agency of creators who have all this plethora of technological means to create things, and where the agency and where the creativity actually lays. Like we're really having a lot of conversations about this right now with all these models that can generate images just from text, and now everyone can become an artist, right?
Yeah.
If that's what being an artist is, which goes back to your question of, is just tool use enough, or what is the artist? Where do you position yourself there?
Oh man, I haven't, I mean, I have played with some of the AI stuff a little bit. I haven't found a use for it in my own practice yet. So I think that one I don't feel fully informed. I will say I've seen a lot of really boring work made, that just work that doesn't interest me at all. But then, I've seen some interesting projects where somebody is kind of truly engaged with it as like a conceptual art piece, like Paul Catanese, who's an artist who we're hoping to have on File Exchange in the future. And I used to, he was the head of department when I was teaching at Columbia College in Chicago, did a piece where it was this like text conversation with the chat bot and asking it to, depict itself how it wanted humanity to perceive it. And then all this crazy imagery came out from the language of like 16th century Western painting of this robot messiah, that he included in his work. And so it was like about the conversation. And that, like, to me, that was a really successful AI art piece because it kind of was broader. It was a broader scope than just a kind of image prompt. And it was much more kind of conceptually engaged. I don't know. Otherwise, I haven't seen a great deal that I like. But I mean, it's hard for me to say because when I scan, there's an element of that that's generative. Like I'm not in full control of what it looks like. And I, again, with a photography background, have this very editorial approach where I'll do 20 scans and then I'll see one particular form or one composition and I'll be like, oh, that's it. That's the one that I want. That has what I'm looking for. And I'll discard the other 19. And then that one I might continue to like sculpt in ZBrush or, work on texture, whatever, make choices about scale and material. But, it is generated. So it's generated and then it's chosen and refined, much as, I mean, a photographer points a camera at a scene, they didn't build that scene, but that's still their artwork. So I think it's a very slippery field, all of it.
I mean, what I hear is like the idea of the artist as a curator of choices, which is very important. That's also part of the creative process. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I also have I was very, very curious, and I wanted to ask you about this. In the Machines for Suffering series, there is quite a strength and quite a like a visible impact and poetic to the support structures themselves, the ones that you use to like withstand what the real 3D print is, or like your skills, right?
Yeah.
And I was fascinated by that because I've always, as someone who has worked in generative algorithms to create 3D form, I am aware of some of the processes that are behind the creation of these support structures, the algorithms behind it, and how many different approaches there are to that, and how those approaches do have an impact on the formal language that those support structures end up having, which for certain 3D printers, certain slicers, is actually very, very bespoke and has like a very strong presence.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
How have you worked with these support structures? Is it something that your software slicer gave you? Is it something that you have challenged? Is it something you have experimented with in different algorithms?
It was at any moment in time, I have about 10 like ridiculous 3D problems that I'm trying to solve, and like might have gone on for years. And that was one of them that I cracked, like trying to get ZBrush to do a bas relief before they had a bas relief tool was another one that, it's like I have these like things and I'm like really stubborn. So what I actually fell in love with the aesthetic originally of the Formlabs supports and the really early Formlabs software, because it had this like cathedral, these like flying buttresses, it had this like Gothic architecture look. And so but you can't get an STL out of it, right? It's proprietary. And so I was like going back and forth with the engineers, and they're like, look, this is 2 weeks of a very highly paid programmer that we're not going to give to you. Then somebody published this hack, but it didn't work. And I tried to have somebody do it in like, kind of reverse engineer it in Rhino, and that didn't work. But then this was finally, I found it. It's a slicer for a totally defunct 3D printer. I think it's called the Cube. And it's like the whole software is about to die. And every time I launch the software, it's like, we're about to kill all these features, like don't rely on this. So I just think I need to feed like every model I have into it right now before it all stops working, or have it on a computer that's completely disconnected from the internet. But I will say it was a very deliberate choice, and I went through a lot of them. And then like I think it's like every media artist, you get this one thing that works and you just like hold on to it for dear life. Like that scanner is 20 years old, it's going to die too, and I'm like getting the parts on eBay, I'm freaking out about it. But yeah, we all have these kind of quests.
We have our tools, we like our tools. Yeah, why
exactly
Beautiful. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I'm going to thank you very much for being here, Sophie. It was a pleasure to spend the afternoon with you. I'm a huge fan of your work. I was very happy to see it again. And I want to please join me, everyone, in thanking Sophie for being with us today.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks so much for listening. And if people have questions that come up later at any point, please feel free to reach out on email or social media or whatever. I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Sophie.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.